The letter was still folded when Dolores set it on the counter, face down, next to Bruno's bowl. She filled the bowl the way she had every morning for 4 years, the same scoop tipped into the same corner of the kitchen, the same low word said before he ate. Her hands did not shake. Only her eyes kept going back to the envelope. "We need to talk about the accounts," it said. 9 words, no signature from Mr. Whitfield, just his nephew's. Bruno ate like it was any other morning. He did not know yet that it was the last bowl she would ever fill for him in that kitchen. Dolores read the letter 3 times before she believed it, not because the words were confusing, because they were not. 9 words, typed, no greeting, no reason. She had expected an explanation, even a bad one, a list of complaints, something to argue with. Instead, there was a signature line, with a name that was not Edgar's, under a sentence that read less like a decision made than a decision coming. She had been fired before. Once, a long time ago, at a house on the coast, for asking why an old woman's medication kept changing without a doctor's order. Nobody had answered the question. They had answered by handing her a check and telling her the family no longer required her services. She had learned something that week she never unlearned. A woman who asked the wrong question in someone else's house did not get an answer. She got a check. She folded the letter along the crease and slid it into the pocket of her apron. Bruno finished the bowl and pressed his head against her shin, the way he did every morning, waiting for the 2 pats on the flank that meant the day could begin. Outside the window, the sky over the east lawn was still the pale gray of early October, the grass silver with frost that hadn't burned off yet, and somewhere down past the hedges, a landscaping crew she'd never once seen paid was already running a blower along the drive. 4 years ago he had been the last dog left at a county shelter outside Millbrook, a pit bull nobody wanted, ribs showing through a short brindle coat, a scar over one eyebrow nobody could explain. The old Mrs. Whitfield had been the one to choose him. She had knelt down in the gravel of the kennel run in a coat that cost more than the shelter's yearly budget and let him lean his whole weight into her before anyone thought to stop her. Dolores had been standing behind her that day, holding the leash nobody had asked for yet. She remembered the way the old woman had looked up and said, "This one, just that, this one." Mrs. Whitfield had died 18 months later. The house had gone quiet, the way houses do, when the person who filled them with noise is gone, and somehow the dog had become Dolores's, in the way that things become someone's when nobody else claims them. He slept in the mudroom, on a folded quilt she'd washed so many times, the pattern had gone soft and pale. He waited by the back step every evening at 5:30, whether or not she was due home at 5:30. And some nights she was certain he could hear the particular sound of her car on the gravel from 100 yards off. Ruth came in through the back door a little after 7, shaking rain off her coat, already talking about the grocery order that hadn't arrived. She didn't notice anything wrong. She never had reason to look twice at Dolores in this kitchen. Dolores was the fixed point. The rest of the house moved around. Dolores answered her the way she answered every morning, agreeing about the grocery order, refilling the kettle, keeping her hands busy so they would not reach for the pocket where the letter sat folded and warm against her hip. She was not ready to say it out loud. Saying it would make it a fact in the room, not just a fact on paper. So she wiped down a counter that was already clean and listened to Ruth talk about the delivery truck and did not once look toward the window over the sink. She measured coffee into the filter with more care than the task required, 3 careful scoops instead of 2, because her hands needed something exact to hold on to. When she finally did look, later, drying her hands on a dish towel, she saw Nathaniel Whitfield crossing the side yard toward the hallway that led to the medicine room. He had a key in his hand. He turned it in the lock, checked it, turned it again. In 12 years, Dolores had never once seen that door locked. Edgar Whitfield called the whole staff into the front room at 9, which never happened before 10, and never on a Tuesday. Dolores stood near the piano with the letter still in her apron pocket, waiting for him to bring it up himself, to look at her the way he always did when he had something honest to say. Instead, Nathaniel stood beside his uncle's chair, one hand resting on the back of it like a man posing for a photograph he had already decided how to frame. He wore a gray sweater she had never seen on him before, soft and expensive looking, the kind of thing a man puts on when he wants to seem like he belongs to a house rather than to a boardroom. "I'm not accusing anyone," Nathaniel said. "I'm just asking why the count keeps changing." He was looking at Dolores when he said it. From where the others stood, near the doorway and along the far wall, it looked like this. The housekeeper, hands folded in front of her, going very still. The young Mr. Whitfield, calm, reasonable, a man simply asking a fair question. The old man in the chair, saying nothing, his jaw working the way it did when his heart was giving him trouble and he didn't want anyone to see it. The cook's assistant, a girl of 19 who had worked in the house 8 months, watched Dolores's face for some sign of guilt and found none, only the flat, careful expression of a woman deciding how many words she could afford to spend. The gardener, standing just inside the door with mud still on his boots, thought about the 12 years he'd watched this same woman carry trays up 3 flights of stairs without being asked twice, and felt his jaw tighten without meaning it to, a tightness he would not have explained to anyone in that room. Ruth stood closest of all, close enough to see that Dolores's hands, folded so carefully, had gone white at the knuckles. Even the driver, who rarely came inside at all, had drifted in from the front hall and stood with his cap still on, turning it slowly in his hands, the way people fidget when they sense a room is about to remember exactly who was standing where. None of them said anything. That was the part that would stay with Dolores longest, longer than the accusation itself. Not one of them said, "Ask her what she thinks," or "Let her speak." They watched, the way people watch weather come in, already deciding where to stand so it wouldn't touch them. "I don't understand what you're implying," Dolores said, and heard how thin her own voice sounded in that tall room with its chandelier throwing hard light down on everyone's face. "I'm not implying anything," Nathaniel said again, in the same reasonable tone, and that was worse than an accusation would have been, because an accusation could be answered. This could not. "The pharmacy's numbers and my uncle's pill count haven't matched in weeks. Someone in this house has access. I'd like to know who." Edgar's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Dolores for one long second, and in that second she saw his shoulders drop the half-inch they only ever dropped when his heart was giving him trouble. His color was bad. His hand on the arm of the chair looked thinner than she remembered it looking a month ago, the wedding ring loose enough now that it had slid down toward the knuckle. "Nobody's accusing anybody of anything tonight," Edgar said finally, which was not the same as saying he believed her, and everyone in the room understood the difference. The staff filed out slowly, the way people leave a room where something has happened that they will discuss in the kitchen later, in low voices, out of Dolores's hearing. Ruth lingered longest, and when she finally left, she touched Dolores's arm once, briefly, a gesture that could have meant anything, and said nothing at all. Dolores stayed a moment after the others had gone, straightening a stack of magazines on the side table that did not need straightening. On the low table by Edgar's chair sat a small brown bottle, its cap not quite seated, tilted slightly against the base of a lamp. Nobody else seemed to notice it. She had refilled that table's ashtray and coasters 1,000 times over 12 years. She knew exactly how everything on it was supposed to sit, and that cap was wrong. She did not touch it. She only looked the way you look at a single crooked picture frame in a house full of straight ones, and something in her chest went very quiet and very cold. She thought about the key turning in the medicine room door that morning. She thought about Nathaniel's hand resting on his uncle's chair like he already owned it. She said nothing, because there was nothing yet she could say that would not sound like exactly what he had just accused her of being. That night, long after the house had gone dark and the last light under Edgar's door had gone out, Dolores stood at the sink finishing the last of the day's dishes, the water gone lukewarm around her wrists, when she heard a step in the hallway outside the kitchen. Soft, careful, the kind of step that belonged to someone who did not want to be heard. She turned from the sink, drying her hands, and found Edgar Whitfield standing in the kitchen doorway in his robe, one hand braced against the frame, as though the walk down the hall had cost him something, looking at her the way a man looks when he has come to ask a question he is afraid of the answer to. "Can't sleep," Edgar said, though that wasn't a question, and he didn't wait for her to answer before he crossed to the table and sat down in the chair he never used, the one meant for deliveries and grocery lists, not for the man who owned the house. Dolores set the kettle on without being asked. It was the only language she trusted herself with right now. "Ruth tells me Bruno slept outside your door again last night," Edgar said, watching her hands move around the stove. "Every night this week. He does that when something's wrong in the house." She said it before she could decide whether it was wise to say. He did it the week Mrs. Whitfield passed. Slept outside her room 3 nights before anyone told him she was gone. Edgar was quiet for a moment. The kettle ticked as it warmed, and somewhere out past the mudroom door, Bruno shifted on his quilt, the tags on his collar giving a small single clink against the floor. "Tell me about him," he said. "Where he came from. I don't think I've ever asked you that." So she told him. The shelter outside Millbrook, 4 years back, the last dog in the last run, ribs you could count through his coat, a scar over one eyebrow that nobody at the shelter could explain, and Dolores had never asked him to. She told him about Mrs. Whitfield kneeling in the gravel in a coat worth more than the shelter's yearly budget, letting the dog lean the whole of his weight into her before anyone thought to stop it. "This one," she'd said, "just that." "She never told me that story," Edgar said. He was looking at his own hands on the table, turning his wedding ring slowly, the way he did when he was working something out that had nothing to do with what he was saying out loud. "She told me she picked him because he ignored the treats and looked at her instead, said the ones chasing the treat weren't the ones worth taking home." Dolores set 2 cups down. She hadn't asked if he wanted tea. She had made it anyway, the way she'd made it for him every night for 12 years when he couldn't sleep, though this was the first time he had come looking for her to drink it with. The steam rose off the cups between them, and outside, wind moved through the last of the leaves on the oak at the edge of the drive, a dry, papery sound that filled the silence better than either of them could have. "He steals things," Edgar said suddenly. "My slippers, my reading glasses. Ruth's hairpins, if she leaves the bathroom door open. He's been doing it since he was a pup. I've found half my study under the porch." "He does the same with mine," Dolores said. "A sock, a hair ribbon I haven't seen in a year. He keeps them somewhere out back, near the woodpile. I've never gone looking. It's his. But never the pills." Edgar looked up at her now, and there was something sharp in his eyes that hadn't been there in the front room earlier that night, something that looked almost like the man she remembered from years ago, before his hands had started to shake in the mornings. "I've dropped them. More than once lately. My hands aren't what they were. A tablet rolls under the table, under the rug, and that dog will walk right past it. Won't touch it, won't even look at it twice. He steals everything else in this house that isn't nailed down, Dolores. Why not that?" She had wondered the same thing for longer than she wanted to admit. She had watched Bruno, over the years, walk a wide, careful circle around anything that smelled like medicine, the vitamin bottle Ruth kept by the sink, the aspirin tin in the hall closet, even the flea tablets meant for him, the same way he skirted the edge of the swimming pool cover in autumn, like he understood, in whatever way a dog understands anything, that some things in this house were not toys. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I only know he's never been wrong about a person in this house, not once, not in 4 years. He wouldn't take to the new pool boy for a whole summer, and it turned out the man was skimming cash off the supply orders. He took to you the first afternoon Mrs. Whitfield brought him home, before you'd said a single word to him. I've stopped trying to explain it. I just trust it now." Edgar didn't answer that directly. He drank his tea in silence for a while, and Dolores let the silence sit, because she had learned a long time ago that some men needed quiet the way other men needed to be told they were right. The clock over the stove ticked through a full minute, then 2, and somewhere in the house a pipe knocked once and went still. "My nephew thinks I'm losing my grip," Edgar said finally, quietly, to the cup more than to her. "Maybe he's not wrong. I forget things. I forget where I've set my glasses down, and then I find them under the porch 3 days later, and I can't remember if that's the dog's doing or my own. I don't know which of you to trust less some mornings, my own head or the people around me." "You can trust your own eyes," Dolores said. "Whatever else." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that asks a question a man isn't ready to say out loud yet, and then he nodded once and stood, steadying himself briefly against the table's edge, and thanked her for the tea in the same formal way he had thanked her for 1,000 cups of tea over 12 years, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. She watched him go back down the hall toward his room, moving slower than he used to, one hand trailing along the wall the way it hadn't a year ago. She sat alone at the table a long while after that, the second cup of tea going cold in front of her, thinking about a scar over a dog's eyebrow nobody could explain, and a woman kneeling in gravel who was gone now, and a nephew who had learned to say "I'm not accusing anyone" in a voice smooth enough to make it sound true. It was past 2 when she heard the door. Not Edgar's door, the heavier one, at the end of the east hall, the one with the lock that had never been used in 12 years until that morning. She rose from the table without meaning to, and crossed to the window that looked out over the side path. Nathaniel Whitfield was coming out of the medicine room, pulling the door shut behind him, with a care that looked nothing like a man simply checking on his uncle's supplies. He glanced once toward the main house, toward the dark windows, the way a man glances when he wants to be certain no one is watching. Then he slid something into the pocket of his jacket, quick, practiced, and walked off toward the garage in the dark, and Dolores stood at the kitchen window with her hand pressed flat against the cold glass, watching him go, and did not move again until the sound of his footsteps had faded completely, and the garage door had rolled down behind him, and the whole east side of the house had gone dark and still again, as though nothing at all had happened. By Thursday, Dolores had stopped pretending to herself that she wasn't watching. She kept a small notebook in the pocket of her apron, the same one she'd always used to jot down grocery lists and the times deliveries were due, and she began writing other things in the margins. A time, a short note. Nathaniel, East Hall, 7:40 p.m., locked behind him. Nathaniel, 11 p.m., 5 minutes, left with something in coat pocket. She didn't know what she was building toward. She only knew that a woman who noticed things and said nothing had already been fired once for asking, and she was not going to let that be the whole of what she'd learned from it. She kept the notebook in the same pocket as her pen, the one that clicked twice before it would write, and she'd taken to carrying both even on the mornings she stayed home, as though the habit itself had become a kind of armor. The house had changed shape in small ways that week, the way a room changes shape when a piece of furniture is quietly moved an inch at a time until nobody remembers exactly where it used to sit. Nathaniel had begun eating dinner with his uncle every night, something he'd rarely done before, always with some reasonable, practical subject on his tongue. He brought small gifts, too, a soft blanket for Edgar's knees, a newer, larger print crossword book, the kind of attentions a nephew pays when he has decided, quietly, to become indispensable rather than merely present. "You shouldn't be managing your own prescriptions at your age, Uncle Edgar," Dolores heard him say one evening, clearing plates in the dining room doorway where neither of them thought to look. Not with your hands the way they are. Let me take that over. I'll keep the schedule, order the refills, keep it all straight. One less thing for you to worry over. Ruth's always handled the ordering, Edgar said, though there wasn't much resistance in it. Dolores, in the doorway with a tray of dessert plates balanced against her hip, felt the shift in the room before she understood it. It was such a small thing on the surface, a nephew offering to lighten an old man's load, and yet something about the ease of it, the practiced warmth in Nathaniel's voice, reminded her of the way a hand slides a chair out from under someone who hasn't yet decided to sit down. Ruth's got the whole house to run. I'm family. It should be family looking after this, not staff. Nathaniel said the word staff, the way a man says a word he doesn't think anyone in earshot will mind hearing, and Dolores, standing 3 feet away with a stack of dinner plates in her hands, minded it more than she let her face show. She set the plates down in the kitchen a moment later, with more force than she meant to, and the crack of china against the counter startled her almost as much as the sentence had. Edgar didn't answer right away. He looked tired in a way that had become ordinary to him and alarming to everyone who loved him, and after a moment he said, "All right, fine, if it means one less thing," and Dolores watched something settle into place behind Nathaniel's eyes that looked, for just a second, like relief instead of concern. It wasn't a lock yet. Nobody else was told to stay out of the medicine room. The door still opened for Ruth when she needed the aspirin, for Dolores when she needed the antiseptic for a cut finger. But the schedule, the count, the ordering, all of it moved quietly into Nathaniel's hands over the course of that single dinner, the way a house moves into new ownership one signature at a time, long before anyone changes the locks for real. Dolores wrote it in the notebook that night. Family should look after this, not staff. Dinner, weds. She underlined family twice, then crossed it out, because underlining felt like something she'd have to explain if anyone ever found the book, and she didn't yet know what she was explaining it for. She sat at her own small kitchen table in the cottage behind the main house a long while after that, the notebook open under the single lamp, and found herself thinking, for the first time in a long time, about the coast, about a doctor's order that had never come, about how quietly a house could close ranks around one of its own once the decision had already been made. Ruth found her in the pantry on Friday afternoon, arms full of dish towels, her face doing something Dolores hadn't seen it do in 11 years working alongside her, a kind of careful blankness, like a woman holding a full cup and trying not to spill it by walking too fast. "The pharmacy called twice this week," Ruth said, without preamble, keeping her voice low even though the pantry door was shut. "Said the order didn't match what they usually send. I told them I don't handle that anymore, that Mr. Nathaniel does, and the girl on the phone got real quiet and said she'd note it in the file." "Note what in the file?" "I don't know. She wouldn't say more, not to me. Said only the account holder could ask about specifics." Ruth set the dish towels down slowly, like she needed her hands free for something. "Dolores, I've worked in this house 9 years and I've never once heard a pharmacy call twice about anything. Not for a refill mix-up, that's not how it goes," Dolores told her, quietly, about the notebook. About the times, the locked door, the small brown bottle with its cap sitting wrong on the table by Edgar's chair. Ruth listened without interrupting, her arms still folded around the dish towels like they were something she needed to hold on to, and when Dolores finished, Ruth was quiet for a long moment, twisting the corner of a towel between her fingers. "If you're right," Ruth said finally, "and I think you might be, what happens to you if you say it out loud? After Tuesday night?" He already stood in that front room and made it sound like you're the one with her hand in the cupboard. It was the question Dolores had been avoiding asking herself all week because she didn't have an answer that didn't frighten her. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know what happened the last time I kept quiet because I was afraid of what saying something might cost me. I lost the job anyway. Only difference was, that time I lost my own respect along with it." Ruth reached over and squeezed her hand once, hard, the way she used to when they'd first started working together, and neither of them had learned yet how much of themselves to hide from each other in this house. "Then we watch together," Ruth said, quietly, "until we've got more than a notebook and a bad feeling." That evening, Dolores found a reason to walk the East Hall she hadn't had a real reason to walk in years, a light bulb out in the hall fixture, or so she told herself, though the bulb had been fine that morning. She carried the stepladder from the utility closet anyway, for cover, its aluminum legs cold and awkward against her hip, and told herself she'd have an honest excuse if anyone stopped her. She was halfway down the corridor, close enough to see the medicine room door, when it opened, and Nathaniel stepped out with a small ledger tucked under one arm. He saw her immediately. There was no pretending otherwise. The hallway was narrow, and there was nowhere for either of them to look but at each other. He didn't say anything at first. He simply stood there, one hand still resting on the door handle behind him, watching her with an expression that had none of the smooth reasonableness of the front room in it. None of the family should look after this warmth from the dinner table. It was flat and cold and entirely without pretense, the look of a man deciding how much a person standing in front of him might already know. "Light bulbs out," Dolores said, and heard, again, how thin her own voice sounded to her, how much smaller than she wanted it to be. She lifted the stepladder slightly, as if it might explain itself. "Is it?" Nathaniel said. Not a question. He glanced up at the fixture, back down at her, and something in his face made a small, precise adjustment, the kind you'd only catch if you'd spent 12 years learning to read the smallest movements in other people's faces for a living, because it was the only power available to you in a house that wasn't yours. He didn't accuse her of anything. He didn't need to. He simply held her gaze a moment longer than was comfortable. Long enough to make certain she understood that he had seen exactly where she was standing, and exactly how close that was to a door he had spent 2 weeks quietly locking against the rest of the house, and then he walked past her without another word. Close enough that she caught the faint chemical smell that clung to the ledger under his arm. Dolores stood alone in the dark hallway for a long moment after his footsteps had faded, her pulse loud in her own ears, and reached up, finally, to change the bulb she had lied about, because it seemed, suddenly, like the only honest thing left to do with her hands. The iron gate of Whitfield House was cold under Dolores's hand, and she was standing on the wrong side of it. Her suitcase sat at her feet on the gravel, the same suitcase she had kept packed in the corner of her room for 11 years, ever since the coast, ever since she'd learned that a woman in her position could be asked to leave a house with less warning than most people got for a dentist appointment. She had never expected to need it here. She had told herself, more than once over 12 years, that Whitfield House was different. She had been wrong about that the way she had been wrong about very little else in her life. She did not remember the drive to the gate. She remembered packing, and she remembered Edgar's study door shut, and she remembered a folder of papers on the front hall table with her name typed at the top, and somewhere between those two moments a stretch of time had simply gone missing, the way it does when the mind refuses to carry a thing all the way through. She remembered, vaguely, someone's hand on her elbow steering her toward the front door, and she remembered thinking, in a distant, floating way, that she should say something, and not being able to find a single word that would have mattered. Her phone rang at the gate, Ruth's name on the screen. "Where are you?" Ruth said, before Dolores had even finished saying hello. "Are you all right? I only just heard. I was at the market, I came back and your room was..." She stopped. "Dolores, I'm so sorry. I didn't know it was happening. Nobody told me until it was already signed." "Signed," Dolores repeated. The word had a shape to it that hadn't quite settled yet. "Nathaniel brought papers into the study this afternoon. I don't know what was in them. I wasn't in the room, but I heard him afterward, in the hall, telling one of the girls it was proof, hard proof, that you'd been altering the count for months to cover for taking product out of the house, selling it, he said." I heard him say the word selling, Dolores, like it was already a fact nobody needed to check. That's not. Dolores's voice broke on the word, and she stopped and pressed the back of her hand hard against her mouth for a second before she trusted herself to speak again. I never touched that room without Edgar or you standing right there. 12 years, Ruth. I know it isn't true, but Mr. Whitfield signed it anyway. Ruth's voice cracked on the anyway. He's not well, Dolores. You know he isn't. I don't think he read 3 lines of what was put in front of him. I think he just wanted the noise in his own house to stop, and Nathaniel gave him a piece of paper that promised it would. Dolores looked back through the bars of the gate at the house she had walked into every morning for 12 years, its windows lit gold against the coming dark, and felt her breath catch and hold, her hand tightening on the cold iron bar until it hurt. A car passed on the road behind her, headlights sweeping briefly across the wet gravel, and then the road was quiet again, and it was only her, and the gate, and the suitcase, and the house lit up like nothing at all had happened inside it. Somewhere upstairs a curtain moved, just slightly, and then was still, and she could not have said whether anyone had actually been standing there, or whether her own eyes were simply looking for something to blame. "And Bruno," she said. "Where's Bruno?" There was a pause on the line that told her the answer before Ruth said it. Nathaniel had him put out in the side yard kennel, said he'd gotten aggressive, hard to control, said it wasn't safe having him loose in the house with everything going on. Dolores, he's never once been aggressive in his life. He growled at Nathaniel through the kennel fence when they moved him, and that was the whole of it. And Nathaniel wrote that down too, like it proved something. Dolores closed her eyes. She could picture the kennel exactly. Cold chain link at the back of the property, meant for storm shelter, never meant for a dog who had slept across the threshold of every person he loved for 4 straight years. She thought of him standing there in the coming dark, waiting for a bowl that wasn't going to come from her hand tonight, pressing his nose against the wire the way he did whenever a car came up the drive that wasn't hers, and something in her that had been holding very carefully together since the front hall finally gave way, just slightly, just enough to let one hard breath through. "I have to go," she told Ruth. "I need you to keep your phone close tonight. Can you do that for me?" "Where will you stay?" "My sister's, in town. I'll call you tomorrow." She paused, her hand tightening on the gate bar until the cold metal bit into her palm. "Ruth, don't say anything to anyone about what you told me. Not yet. I need a little time to think." "Dolores, you're not going to do anything foolish, are you?" "No," Dolores said, and found, saying it, that it was true. "I'm going to do something careful." She picked up the suitcase and walked the half-mile down the drive to the road where she'd called a cab, because there was no one left inside those gates who would have driven her, and she did not look back at the house until she reached the road itself, and when she did look back, it was only to fix the shape of it in her mind, the lit windows, the dark hedge line, the small square of the side kennel she couldn't quite see from that distance but knew, now, was there. The cab driver tried small talk twice on the drive into town and gave up both times, reading something in her silence that told him to leave her be. She sat with the suitcase across her knees like a shield, watching the dark fields slide past the window, streetlights coming up more frequent as the road narrowed toward the edge of town, and thought of nothing at all for the length of 3 whole miles, which felt, in its own strange way, like a mercy. She did not cry on the ride into town. She had done her crying, if that was even the right word for it, in the 11 minutes she'd stood alone at the gate before Ruth called, a kind of dry, silent shaking that had passed through her and left her strangely clear-headed on the other side of it, the way grief sometimes clears a person out entirely before it lets them start again. At her sister's kitchen table that night, the suitcase still unopened by the door, a plate of food her sister had made her going cold and untouched at her elbow, Dolores took out the small notebook from her apron pocket. She had grabbed it without thinking. the one thing from 12 years in that house that had come away with her by instinct rather than by packing, and opened it to the pages of times and dates she'd been keeping for 2 weeks. Nathaniel, East Hall, 7:40 p.m. Nathaniel, 11 p.m., 5 minutes. Something in coat pocket. Pharmacy called twice. She read it through twice, slowly, the way she might read a letter she wasn't sure she was ready to open. It wasn't proof of anything. She understood that. A housekeeper's private jottings against a signed legal document a man had put in front of his own uncle. She knew exactly how that would sound to anyone outside this house, knew it the way she'd known, at the coast all those years ago, that a question asked by the wrong person carries no weight at all, however true it is. But it was something. It was a place to start. She had spent 12 years being the fixed point other people moved around, the one who noticed and said nothing, because saying nothing had once seemed like the safest thing a woman without power could do. She thought of Bruno standing in a cold kennel tonight for the crime of growling once at a man who deserved far worse than a growl, and she thought of Edgar's hand shaking on the arm of his chair while he signed a piece of paper he likely hadn't finished reading, and something in her that had stayed careful and quiet for a very long time finally decided it was done being either of those things. She was still sitting at the table an hour later, the notebook open in front of her, a cold cup of tea at her elbow, her sister long since gone up to bed with a worried look she hadn't quite managed to hide, when the phone rang again. Ruth's name on the screen a second time that night, and something in the speed of the ring itself, the way it cut through the kitchen's silence, told Dolores before she even answered that whatever was coming next was not going to let either of them rest. "The pharmacy just called again," Ruth said, before Dolores had finished lifting the phone to her ear, her voice pitched high and fast, in a way Dolores had never once heard it in 9 years of knowing her. "Dolores, something's wrong." "Slow down," Dolores said, though her own pulse had already picked up to match Ruth's voice. "Tell me exactly what they said." "A woman from the pharmacy, not the one who called before. She asked for Mr. Whitfield directly, and when I told her he wasn't taking calls tonight, she asked, careful, like she was choosing every word, whether anyone in the house had noticed his heart medication running low. I said I didn't handle that anymore. She went quiet for a second and then she said, "Well, someone should look into it soon," and hung up before I could ask her anything else. Dolores sat very still at her sister's kitchen table, the cold tea forgotten at her elbow. "That's twice in 1 week they've called about the same thing and wouldn't say more. I think they know something, Dolores. I think they're not allowed to say it over the phone to just anyone. Maybe it's some kind of policy. Then I'll go in person," Dolores said, "tomorrow. Meet me at the coffee place on Birch Street at 10. Bring anything you can, receipts, order slips, anything with a date on it that came through that pharmacy in the last 2 months. Dolores barely slept that night. She lay in her sister's guest room, listening to the unfamiliar creak of an unfamiliar house, the notebook still on the nightstand where she'd left it, and thought about Bruno alone in the cold, and about 8 weeks, and about how a man could go on smiling across a dinner table while quietly emptying a room a few doors down. The coffee shop on Birch Street was 3 miles from the Whitfield gates, small enough that Dolores had never once seen anyone from the house inside it, which was exactly why she'd chosen it. Ruth was already at a corner table when she arrived, a folder of paper in front of her, her hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched. She'd come straight from the house without changing, still in her apron under her coat, as though she hadn't trusted herself to stop moving long enough to think about it. They spread it all out together, Dolores's notebook, its neat columns of times and dates, a handful of old delivery receipts Ruth had pulled from a kitchen drawer before anyone thought to ask why. They lined the dates up side by side on the table between them, and the pattern took shape faster than either of them expected. 3 times in the last month, a receipt showed a delivery on the same evening Dolores's notebook showed Nathaniel locking the medicine room door behind him for longer than the routine restocking should have taken. "That's not nothin'," Ruth said quietly, looking at the lined-up dates like she was afraid of them. "It's not proof, either." Dolores kept her voice low, though there was no one near enough to hear. "It tells us he's careful about timing. It doesn't tell us what he's doing in that room, or where anything's going once it leaves the house." She excused herself and called the pharmacy from the payphone outside, giving her name honestly, saying only that she used to manage the household accounts for Mr. Whitfield and had some questions about recent orders. The young man who answered put her through, after a moment, to someone older, a woman who introduced herself only as the pharmacist, her voice careful in a way that told Dolores she'd had this exact conversation shape itself in her mind before, with someone else, and hadn't liked how it went. "I can't say for certain over the phone, Mrs. Vance," the pharmacist said, and there was something almost apologetic in it, the tone of a professional bound by rules she clearly wished didn't apply here. "But something about his refills hasn't looked right in a while. I'd need to pull the full file, cross it against what's actually been picked up versus what's been billed, and that's not something I can do standing at this counter with you on the other end of a phone. If Mr. Whitfield himself called or came in, I could go over all of it with him directly. He's not well enough to make that call right now," Dolores said, which was as close to the truth as she could get without saying more than she had any right to say to a stranger. "Is there anything at all you can tell me, even a general sense?" A pause. "Off the record, because I probably shouldn't even say this much, the pattern doesn't look like a man forgetting to reorder. It looks more like somebody's been managing the paperwork to make sure it doesn't look like anything at all. That's the most I can tell you without the actual file in front of me." Dolores thanked her and hung up, and stood at the payphone a moment longer than she needed to, the wind coming up cold off the street, before she went back inside to where Ruth was waiting. She relayed it as exactly as she could remember it. Ruth's face went pale. "So we still don't have a number," Ruth said. "We don't have anything we could actually hand to someone and say, 'Here, look at this.'" "No, not yet." Dolores folded the notebook closed and held it in both hands, the way she might have held something fragile. "We could go to the police with what we have, but I think about what happens to a man like Edgar if two women he trusted for years walk into a police station with a homemade notebook and a handful of receipts and no hard number to back it up. I think about what Nathaniel does with that, if it comes to nothing. He'll make sure it's the last thing either of us is ever believed about in this town." "Then what?" Ruth said. "We just wait?" "We wait for the number," Dolores said. "The pharmacy has it," she said herself. "It's in the file. Someone with the right to ask, Edgar himself, or someone standing close enough to him when he's lucid enough to ask it. That's who gets that number. Not us, not from a payphone." Ruth looked down at the lined-up receipts, at the notebook, at all of it laid out on a coffee shop table like evidence in a case neither of them had the standing to bring. "I hate this," she said. "I hate that we have to be this careful about telling the truth." "So do I." Dolores reached across the table and took Ruth's hand, the way Ruth had taken hers in the pantry days before. "But I'd rather be careful and right than fast and wrong. I only get to do this once." They sat a while longer, working out, in low voices, who might still be willing to speak plainly if Dolores could reach them, a name Ruth remembered from the pharmacy's old paper files, a cousin of Edgar's who'd once handled the household's insurance and might still take a phone call from Ruth if it came to that. It was slow work, and neither of them felt any better for having done it, only steadier, the way two people feel steadier walking into wind together rather than each walking into it alone. The coffee between them had gone cold and forgotten, and the shop had filled and half emptied again around their corner table, and still neither of them had touched a single cup. Ruth's phone buzzed on the table between them, and she glanced down at it, and Dolores watched her face change before a single word was spoken. "It's the gardener's wife," Ruth said, already answering. "She never calls me." She held the phone to her ear, listened for 3 seconds, and went white all the way to her lips. "Say that again." Say that again slowly. She lowered the phone, her hand shaking now in a way Dolores had never seen it shake before. Nathaniel told Tom to deal with the dog tonight, Ruth said. Said Bruno's gotten too dangerous to keep on the property. Dolores, he means to have him put down before morning. Dolores was already on her feet. When? She said. How long do we have? She said Tom put it off till tonight. Said he didn't want to do it, but Nathaniel's paying him extra to make it quiet. She thinks he'll wait till after dark, when the staff's gone home. Ruth's hand was still shaking on the table. Dolores, that's tonight. That's hours, not days. Dolores's phone rang before she'd even reached the door of the coffee shop. A number she didn't recognize. Local, the pharmacy's exchange. Mrs. Vance, it's the pharmacist you spoke with this morning. The woman's voice had changed since the payphone call. Quicker now, no longer careful, like a person who had decided which side of a line she was standing on. I'm not supposed to call a former employee about an account, but there's a duty to report when a controlled substance pattern looks like this one, and I'd rather you hear it from me than from someone with a badge. I pulled the full file after we spoke. 8 weeks. That's how long it's been since a single refill on his heart prescription actually matched what was billed to the account. 8 weeks of paperwork saying medication went out that never once left this pharmacy. 8 weeks. Dolores stood on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop with the phone pressed to her ear and felt everything she'd been circling for 2 weeks finally sit still and make sense at once. Ruth's voice in the pantry, 4 days ago. The pharmacy called twice this week, said the order didn't match. Not a new problem, not a sudden mistake. 8 weeks of it, quietly managed, quietly buried under a ledger and a locked door, and a nephew who had made himself, dinner by dinner, the only person in the house with the authority to ask. He wasn't hiding a habit. He was running out of time to hide a pattern, and something, her notebook, maybe, or Ruth's questions, or simply the pharmacy finally refusing to let it slide another week, had told him the walls were closing in faster than he'd planned for. A man that cornered didn't tidy up quietly. He got rid of whatever was inconvenient, fast, before anyone else had the chance to look at it too closely. Bruno had never touched a pill in 4 years. Bruno slept outside doors when something in the house was wrong before anyone else could name it. Bruno had a scar over one eyebrow nobody could explain, and a habit of walking a wide, careful circle around anything that smelled like medicine. He wasn't dangerous. He was the one thing in that house that had never once been wrong. I have to go, Dolores said into the phone, and was already moving. She didn't wait for a cab. Ruth drove, faster than either of them had any business going on the narrow road out of town, both hands locked hard on the wheel, her knuckles pale in the dashboard light. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say that the speedometer wasn't already saying for them. Fields went by in the dark, fence posts flicking past like a metronome nobody had asked to keep, and Dolores kept her eyes on the road ahead because looking at the clock on the dash only made the minutes feel longer. 8 weeks, she thought. 8 weeks, and a man growing more afraid of a notebook and a housekeeper than of what he'd actually done. She thought, too, of the coast, of the last time she had waited too long to act on something she already knew in her bones. She was not going to be that woman twice. Not tonight. Whatever came of it, she would rather stand in front of Edgar and Nathaniel both and say it out loud than sit quiet in a car and let a dog she loved pay for her carefulness. She thought, too, of the day Mrs. Whitfield brought him home from the shelter, ribs still showing through his coat, the scar over his eyebrow still fresh enough to catch the light, leaning the whole of his weight into a stranger because nobody had ever told him not to trust one. He had trusted every person in that house since the day he arrived. She was not going to be the one who let that trust go unanswered. There, Ruth said, cutting the headlights a quarter-mile short of the gates, coasting the last stretch on momentum alone, gravel crunching soft under the tires. The dark felt bigger without the lights. Dolores's heart was going so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The Whitfield gates were locked for the night by the time they reached them, the front drive dark except for the porch light and one window upstairs. Dolores didn't try the gate. She knew the property the way she knew the inside of her own hands. 12 years of hauling groceries and trash bins and Christmas trees through the service entrance around the east side, where the old fence had a gap behind the hedge that nobody had ever bothered fixing because nobody but the staff ever used it. She went through it in the dark, tearing the sleeve of her coat on a nail she'd forgotten was there, and came up along the tree line toward the kennel and the shed beyond it. Ruth close behind her, with a flashlight held low against her leg so the beam wouldn't carry. The grass was wet through her shoes within 20 steps. Somewhere off to the left, a dog barked once, twice, then fell quiet, and Dolores's whole body went cold at the sound before she realized it wasn't him, too far off. A neighbor's dog, answering something in the dark that had nothing to do with her. They kept low along the hedge line, past the old rose bed Mrs. Whitfield used to tend herself, its canes bare and black now against the dark, past the greenhouse with its one cracked pane that had never been fixed because nobody remembered which pane it was until the light hit it just right. Dolores knew every stone of this path. She had walked it in daylight 1,000 times, arms full of clippings or trash or holiday lights, and never once imagined she would walk it like this, at a half crouch, breath held, listening for a man's footstep instead of birdsong. A security light near the garage clicked on once, caught by nothing more than a blowing branch, and both women froze against the hedge until it clicked off again and the dark folded back over them. The kennel was empty. For one long, terrible second Dolores's chest went hollow, and then she heard it, a low, single bark, not frightened, not aggressive, just insistent, coming from the old garden shed near the woodpile at the back of the property. They ran. Dolores felt her ankle turn once on the uneven ground, and kept going anyway, Ruth a half step behind her with the flashlight now cutting a hard, jerking arc across the grass. And the shed came up out of the dark faster than she expected, a low black shape against the tree line, its door shut tight. The shed door had a simple hasp lock, no key, just a bolt slid through, and her hands were shaking so badly it took her 3 tries to work it free. Somewhere behind that door Bruno had gone still, listening, the way he always did when he recognized a footstep before he'd even seen a face. When the door finally swung open, he came out at a full run, not toward her, not toward the open dark of the yard, but straight past her, straight toward the woodpile at the edge of the property line, the same corner he'd been dragging things to for 4 years. Bruno, he didn't stop. He reached the woodpile and began digging at it, fast, frantic, the way he never dug, throwing aside 2 split logs and a corner of old tarp until his nose found the gap he was looking for, and he pulled something free with his teeth and turned and stood there in the dark with it held gently, almost carefully, in his mouth, looking back at her the way he'd looked at her every morning for 4 years, waiting. Dolores knelt in the wet grass and reached out her hand, and Bruno set it down against her palm without being asked. A small tin box, the kind that once held mints, the hinge rusted, the paint half worn away. She turned it over once in her hands. It rattled faintly when she moved it. Ruth crouched beside her, the flashlight beam trembling slightly as she held it steady over the box, both of them breathing hard, the cold air burning a little in Dolores's chest. For a moment neither of them moved, neither of them reached to open it. It felt, for that one suspended second, like everything since the letter had shrunk down to fit inside a single rusted mint tin sitting in the grass between 2 frightened women and 1 very tired dog. Bruno sat back on his haunches beside them, sides heaving, and watched the tin the way he had once watched Mrs. Whitfield's face, patient and sure, as if he already knew exactly what it was going to cost the man who'd hidden it. Somewhere behind her, close, too close, gravel shifted under a boot. Dolores turned, half rising from the wet grass, the tin box still held against her chest. It was Edgar. He stood a few feet away in his robe, a coat thrown over it against the cold, a cane he almost never used gripped in one hand, his face pale in the light from Ruth's flashlight. He must have heard the shed door, or Bruno's bark, or simply come looking for a house that had gone strange and empty around him. He was not looking at Dolores. He was looking at the box in her hands, and at what Bruno had pulled loose from the woodpile beside it, a second item, half buried still, that Ruth's light had just caught. A torn strip of paper, a pharmacy label, his own name printed clearly across the top of it, above a prescription number that did not match the bottle it should have belonged to. Edgar knelt, slowly, his knees protesting, and picked it up himself before anyone could stop him. He turned it over in his fingers, tilting it toward the flashlight beam, reading it the way a man reads something he already suspects but has not yet let himself believe. He opened the tin box in Dolores's hands without asking, and looked at what was inside, a dozen small white tablets, still sealed in their foil strip, his own name on the label wrapped around them, and beside that strip, folded small, a second label, blank, unused, the kind meant to be pasted over a real one. He didn't say anything at first. Dolores watched his mouth go slack, then his jaw set hard, the color draining out of his face in stages she could almost count, and she understood that whatever was happening in him now had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with 8 weeks of his own hands shaking a little more each morning. 8 weeks of feeling less like himself and not knowing why. "This is mine," Edgar said quietly, to no one, to the label itself. Then he looked up, past Dolores, toward the path from the house, and his voice changed, went hard in a way Dolores had never once heard it in 12 years. "Why do you have empty bottles with my name on them?" Nathaniel came around the corner of the shed at a near run, out of breath, and stopped dead at the sight of the three of them kneeling in the wet grass around an open tin box. For 1 second nobody moved, then Nathaniel lunged. He grabbed for the box before anyone could react, his hand closing hard over Dolores's wrist, and she held on, both of them wrenching at it between them, Ruth shouting something neither of them heard, Bruno barking sharp and fast at Nathaniel's heels. The box tore loose from both their hands and hit the ground, the old hinge finally giving way, spilling the foil strip and the blank label and a scatter of loose tablets into the wet grass. A jagged edge of the tin caught Nathaniel's palm as it fell. He swore and pulled his hand back, a thin line of blood welling up across his fingers. Dolores went down hard on one hip, Ruth's arm catching her before she hit the ground fully, and for a moment the only sound in the dark was Bruno's barking and Edgar's cane striking the ground once, hard, like a gavel. "Enough," Edgar said, and drove the cane down a second time, and the yard went still around him. Even Nathaniel went quiet, his chest heaving, the blood from his palm dripping unnoticed onto the wet grass at his feet. Lights were coming on in the house behind them, the gardener first, then 2 of the kitchen staff, drawn by the noise, then Ruth's own husband, who'd driven up not 5 minutes behind her without either of them realizing he'd followed. Someone had a phone out. Someone was already saying the word police into it, low and fast, while Nathaniel stood frozen in the wet grass with a thin cut across his palm and his uncle's eyes on him, and did not try to run. Dolores sat where she'd fallen, the torn tin box beside her. Bruno pressed hard against her side, his weight solid and warm and exactly where it had always been. Edgar reached down, not toward his nephew, but toward her, his hand out, and helped her to her feet himself, slowly, the 2 of them steadying each other in the cold. 12 years, Edgar said, quiet enough that only she could hear it. 12 years, and I let 9 words on a piece of paper undo all of it in one afternoon. Behind them, Nathaniel was led away toward the house between the gardener and Ruth's husband, saying nothing at all, and the security light over the garage came on, flooding the wet grass and the broken tin box and the scattered white tablets in a hard, flat glow. And somewhere far off a car started, and the sound of it faded slowly into the dark until the yard was quiet again, and cold, and, for the first time in a long while, entirely honest. The kitchen smelled like coffee again by 7 the next morning, the way it always had. Nathaniel had spent the night answering questions in a room at the county station instead of sleeping in his own bed, and the deputy who'd taken him from the yard had told Edgar, before driving off, that the pharmacy's file alone would likely be enough to hold him. Edgar found her there, at the counter, the same spot she'd stood the morning the letter came. He set an envelope down beside her hand, unopened this time, and waited until she looked at it before he spoke. "It says I'm sorry," he said. "Effective immediately, I'd like you to stay. It's the best I could do for the paper I signed without reading." Dolores almost smiled. "Almost. I want to ask you something," Edgar said, and there was a kind of shyness in it she'd never once heard from him. "The pharmacy, the accounts, all of it. Who do you think should manage it going forward? I trust your judgment more than my own signature these days." Nobody had asked her opinion on anything in this house in 12 years. She thought about that for a moment, standing in the morning light with the coffee pot warm in her hand, and found she didn't need long to answer. "Ruth," she said, with me looking over the numbers alongside her, 2 sets of eyes. Edgar nodded, like it was the simplest thing in the world, because for the first time in a long time it was. Ruth came in a few minutes later with the morning paper and a look that said the whole house already knew the shape of what had happened. She poured herself coffee and sat at the table without asking, the way family does. Dolores picked up the bowl from beside the sink, filled it the way she had every morning for 4 years. Same scoop, same corner of the kitchen, same low word. Bruno came in from the yard, sides damp with dew, and ate like it was any other morning. It was.